If you want to learn how to make a top-down dungeon crawler, something inspired by classics like Gauntlet and even Diablo, something that has path-finding enemies, an area of effect explosions, something that was the beginning of my own dungeon crawler game, a top-down, couch co-op, action RPG with randomly generated levels and multiple player characters, then keep watching and I'll show you how. G'day gamers, and welcome back to our top-down dungeon crawler. In the previous episode, we added a dash effect to escape enemies, but in this episode, in order to make the game look like the game I show in the opening sequence, we need to add a few effects, like dust and hit effects, some sound, and a few other small features. Now, showing dust when the entities move helps ground them to the scene, and it's one of those little touches you can add to a game to give it more life. So when creating dust, I like to have a little variety in the sprites, so I have two dust sprites which I've drawn as simple animations. These were not included in the original resource pack, so I've put an updated link in this video with the dust sprites and the sounds that we'll use in this particular episode. So dust 1 and 2 are their names. I'm just going to drag them over and drop them into the objects folder. And I'm going to make sure that we center the origin on both of them. Because they're GIF files, we can set the frame rate in the file. And now we need an object to represent those sprites in the room. So I'm going to create an O_dust object. And there's no need to assign the sprite here because we're going to do it in a create event. So let's just add a create event. And here, what I want to do is set the sprite that we're going to use. And because we've got two, I'm just going to drag in an instance variable code block. I'm going to go down to sprite. I'm going to use the function choose, and that allows us to add any number of arguments, and it'll pick one of those. So in this case, we're going to pick sdust1 and sdust2. And therefore, it'll pick that and assign it to the sprite. In Gmail, we just write sprite index, and we use the choose function that way. Now, to give the dust some more variety, I'm also going to do a similar thing with a horizontal scale. I'm going to say choose -1 or 1, and I'll take a copy of that, and we'll do the same thing for the vertical scale. And therefore, it'll flip it up and down, or it'll mirror it left and right, and it'll give it some variety with that sprite. Now, the last thing is we need the dust to be drawn at the correct location in regards to its depth and when it's being drawn to the screen. So we can just assign the depth at this point. And I'm just going to set the depth of the sprite to be -y. And this is just a good way to set the order so the sprite is drawn not on top of things that are below it. And we do that with the entities as well. Now, the other thing we need is an animation end event. So let's go to add other animation end. And here's where the sprite can destroy itself once it finishes playing its animation. So we'll just put a destroy instance or use the function instance destroy. So now that we have our dust object, we need a way to create the dust. And if we do this every step, there'll be way too much dust happening. So in the player's create event, go down to entities, go to our player. And what we want to do is go to the create event, and here we can create some variables for our dust. So right down the bottom, just for our dust, we're going to create a create dust timer initial. And I'm going to set it to 8. So that means we're only going to create dust every 8 frames, and then we'll reset it to this value. And we need a timer that we can count down with, and that'll be our create dust timer. And we'll just set it to 0. So we'll create a dust object the first time it runs, then we'll reset this timer to this value. And sure, we could just set this value directly, but by doing it like this, with our initial values, we actually can easily go to the create event and modify any value without having to find where we're setting it. And that's why we do it this way. Now I'm going to create a check dust function. And this is where we will process the dust. So we'll check if the timer's ready and we'll create it if needed. Now we do it in a function so that we can use it in different states and not have to duplicate the code. So let's go over to our scripts. And so I noticed our scripts, we didn't put them in alphabetical order. So I'm going to click my fingers and it's all going to be in alphabetical order. That's much better. So now let's also create a check dust function. And in here, basically what we're going to do is create the dust when our dust timer is 0. I'm just going to add this code. So here we're taking 1 off the timer per step and we're checking if it's less than or equal to 0. And if it is, we come down here and we set our timer to our initial value. We check if we're actually moving. And we do that by looking at our X position and our XP, which is our X previous position. And if they're not equal, or Y does not equal to our Y previous, well, that means we are moving. And if we are moving, we want to create an instance of dust. So I make sure this is on the right-hand side here. And then we create an instance of the dust relatively to the X. So just 4 left and 4 right. And I'm not using relative here because I'm using bbox bottom. So I'm adding a little value to that. So I'm creating the new instance of dust at the bottom of this instance. And we're just creating it on the player layer. It's kind of irrelevant because we are setting the depth in the create event directly, but we still need to give a layer in order to create the instance. Now this XP and YP, we might need to do some setup for the player because I don't believe we're setting that per step like we are for the enemy. So we'll just need to go in and create those in a moment. So this check dust function, if we go to the player and we just go to the player's step event, and in here, let's use our execute script to call that function. So I'm just going to put it down here, probably just before the anim. So we'll take a copy and a paste of that. And here we're not checking for the bomb, we're just checking for the dust. And we'll take a copy of this. And down here when we're dashing, we want to see dust as well. So I'll just pop it down here. And in knockback, yeah, let's have a look at that and put it there as well. I'll just put it above the anim. And for the dead state, I'm going to add that as well. And we can see the dust when the player slides along the ground, basically. Now, as I said, the XP and YP values for the player at the moment for our enemy, if I go have a look at our check enemy's anim script, we're setting it down the bottom of the enemy anim script. So I'm going to take a copy of this. And for the player's anim, we can just go down the bottom and we can do the same thing. And therefore, we're assigning the current player's X to XP at the end of the step event. So therefore, the next step event for the player, these values won't be equal to each other if the player is moving. So let's press play and test that out. So there we go. We have dust. If we're not moving, the dust stops. Okay, that's looking good. But now that we've got it as a function, we can easily add it to the enemies when they are moving too. I just wanted to take a break and appreciate who makes these videos possible. This month, my legendary supporters are Big Honk, Jake Dowds, HK Pig, Mark Savage, Pillsbury, Charlie, and Tomb of the Unknown Gamemaker. I've just released a new platformer course over on Udemy. All legendary supporters receive free codes to whatever my current courses are. As well as tutorials and courses, I've also been working on a few games. One of those is Tank Dash. Now this is a fun couch co-op game, and there's a page up on Steam. Now the way Steam works is it promotes games that have high wish lists. So even if you're not interested in purchasing the game, and you appreciate the content that I give you, if you can go over to the link in the description and just wish list this game, it's free to do so, but it'll really help me out. I also have a few videos on the channel showing some of the Bullet League gameplay if you want to go check them out. Now let's continue. So let's go and have a look at our enemy object. So our enemy, let's put this up here and this here as well. So the enemy parent, and let's have a look at their step event. So we have an idle state. We don't need it in the idle state for the enemy, but down in the move state, yes, let's do that just before here. So I'll take a copy and a paste of that. And let's just check our dust here. We'll copy that now. And for knockback, yeah, let's put it to here. When they're attacking, we don't need that. And when they're dead, let's add that as well, just there. Now that's not going to work because we did create some variables that they will need in order for that to work. So let's go back to our player and the create event. And here we have some variables that are going to be needed for the enemy as well. So you know what? If we need them for enemy and for the player, well, where's the place to put them? Let's cut them out of here. And instead, let's put them in the entity parent because that has all the variables that are used by both objects. So down the bottom, let's just paste that here. So if you have a variable that's going to be used by both enemies and player, you can remember to use it in the parent directly. So let's press play and we should see the enemies now have dust as well. And it starts to look like there's more chaos happening here. That works really well, but if you have lots of enemies, you may find creating all of that dust can slow your game down. An easy way to cater for this is to just check how many dust instances you have, and if there are too many, don't create any more. So what I've done in the check dust function is before we create the instance, we check how many instances of odust we have, and I'm storing the value into num, it's just a temporary. And then we use a check and say if the number is less than 100 or our object index is equal to oPlayer. Now object index stores the asset value of this instance. So if it's oPlayer, we want to create the dust because you always want to make sure the player has some dust. Or if we haven't created 100 at this moment, then we go ahead and we create the dust instance. And it looks like this over in GML. We use instance number, and then we just do the check here. Now to make the game feel better, when anyone takes damage, there should be an impact animation at the point of contact. It makes your game feel more punchy and impactful. So if you look inside the original resource pack, I have an animation called S_hit. Now I'm just going to drag that in and we'll just pop that in here under our objects. Make sure we center the origin because we want it to spawn there. And this is what it looks like. Now, I'll apologize for the name. Once you see it, you really can't unsee it. So sorry about that. And I'm going to right click here and say create object. And I'm going to call this O_hit. And we'll drag that sprite over to the object. Now, just like before, we need to add an other animation end event. And inside here, we'll just add that destroy instance code block or instance destroy if you're in GML. And therefore the animation will play and it'll just destroy itself. So now we need to create the hit when we cause damage to the player or to an enemy. And we cause damage in the damage entity function. So let's go in there and down the bottom, just before we're returning our dead status, we can create the instance of O_hit. Now we just want to create that at relative 0, 0, so the X and Y position. And I'm going to put it on the arrow layer. And also I'm going to capture the ID that's returned and store it in inst. And the reason being is then I can go down here and I can set the inst.depth to be -room height. Now, because we're using Y as the position within the room to draw the depth, if we put -room height, that's the highest depth we'll have. So basically making it a negative means that it'll be above everything else. So now when we get hit or the enemy gets hit with an arrow or bomb, we'll see that effect play at the target's X and Y position. So let's press play and check that out. So now we see this animation effect, and even if we throw a bomb down, you'll see that it'll play on all of the entities that get hit. And it looks pretty cool. Now the game looks very similar to the original vision that I showed at the start, but there's one thing missing, and that is some sound effects to give it more punch and just to make it feel better. So it's a good time to add your sound effects early, as they can take time and it can become laborious when you try to do them all at once later in the project. So if you look inside your sounds folder, where the resources are, you'll see that I have all of these sounds already set up, and I've gathered these from a website called zapsplat.com. So if you search for game sounds, you'll find there are free offerings which can be pretty decent, but they may require you to give attribution to the site you got them from. Now these are free and they do require me to give that attribution or credit, and you'll see that I've done that in the main directory of the resource folder. I do say where they came from. Now you can drag these into the sounds folder, and depending on your sound, you might need to change them to stereo as well if you do this. I'm going to drag all of these and drop them directly into that sounds folder. Now you might have to go over here and change this to stereo if the sound is stereo. Now you can sample it here by pressing play, and you can change the volume of each sound if you need. So you want to just do that, and just if you want to put on the stereo, depends if they are, or you can just right click here and say close all but this, and then close this and just have them all being set at mono. Now the thing about adding sounds is you are looking to play it in a location in your code which happens only once per action. Otherwise, the sound's going to repeat multiple times. So with these sounds, you can see that I've named them accordingly. So these are what I would consider the major sounds at the moment in the game. I'm just going to create a new group here called done. And that way, as we add sounds, we can move them into this folder, and we know that we've done that one already. I just wanted to pause for a moment and thank the epic supporters for this video. They are Robert Churches, Chris LeBlanc, Dennis Evans, Alex Bukowski, Joseph Carmelo, Marlo Dobe, Jargon P, Logan H, Hotax, Scott J, Hyperacid, Omar Navar, John Lawson, and Tuan Tran. Thank you so much for your support. Now back to the video. So we've just added an effect for the hit, so let's also add the sound for that too. Let's look at our arrow impact. So if we search for arrow, and inside of our arrow, where the enemy is hit, we can add a sound effect in here. So just after our arrow dies, if I type in audio, then we can add the play audio function. And if you click on this, it'll show you all your sounds, and then you can search for what you need. I'm just looking for the arrow impact. Now you can change the gain and the pitch to make it sound a bit different. And I'm going to do this actually. I'm going to set this to a random range of 0.6 and 1.4. So a value of 1 is the normal pitch, but by doing this, we're changing the pitch slightly for each hit, and it just gives some variety to your game. Now in GML, you also need to enter a priority value. That just means how important is this sound. A higher value means it has more priority, and if there are not enough resources in your system to play all the sounds, the higher priority sounds will be played first. You also need to enter if this will loop, and then these arguments with the square brackets are optional values, meaning you don't have to enter them. So let's take a copy of this. So we also have a sound for when the arrow hits solid. And I'm going to do the same thing. We'll paste in the arrow impact, and we'll also choose the arrow hits the wall. Now you might have noticed there was the sound of an arrow hitting enemy. I won't be using that, so I'm going to drag that for done. And we also want the hit the wall and the impact. So they're all done at the moment. So when the enemy hits a player, we have an effect right here. So I'm just going to search for hitbox, which is the enemy's hitbox. And when it interacts with the player, that's when we want to have the sound. Now I'm not putting the sound directly in the damage entity because that can damage different entities. So you want to play a different sound depending on who's doing the damage. So here we should have our player hit. And I'm just going to minimize this down to maybe 0.85 and 1.5. And we'll just take a copy of that. So some sound effects will sound better with the pitch changed. I'm just minimizing it for these ones. But you probably do a little bit of trial and error to work out what works for you. So that's our player hit. Now we have some alert sounds, and that's for when the enemy first sees the player. So we have a check for player function. Let's go in there. And once again, we need to run the sound only once. When something changes, when a variable changes, that's the time to run it. And if I go back up here, right at the top, as we're checking for our player, right here where we become alert. So at that point, alert is equal to false. And every time afterwards, alert's always going to be true. So it's a good time to run the sound at that point. So if we drag an if check in, and I'm going to drop it not up here, but just above this particular assigned variable code block. And here we can look if alert is equal to false. So if we haven't become alert yet, then let's put a choose in here. And here we want to choose one of the sounds. And we have our sound enemy alert 1, 2, and 3. So we'll just take a copy of those and just change the values on those. And we'll set that as our SND file or a sound file, and it's just temporary. So we're picking one of these sounds and setting the variable to the asset index of that. And then what we can do is just play that sound. And I'm just going to set the pitch for 1 because we already are using different sounds to add some variety. So just in here, we can look at our sounds and we've used up all of these. Now we have this enemy attack, and the enemy does their attack in a perform attack function. So let's go into that. And they're attacking only once here. So this only runs once. So just over here at check for player, let's take a copy of these two. So we can just put that down the bottom here. And we'll do a choose again because we do have 3 things to pick from. So we want to pick from our enemy attack 1, 2, and 3. We're storing that into our sound variable, and we'll just make that a temp. So here we want to play our sound. And it's up to you whether you want to leave this in or not. You can play around with it. It's not game breaking in any way. So the last sound effect that we have is for the enemy. So I'll drag these 3 into our done. Is the enemy dying here? And we do that in the isDead function. Actually, it's right here. So if you go all the way down the bottom, when we're looking at the sound effects here, we look at the object index. So we look at if it's a player or an enemy. And if it's a player, we do something with the bow. And we could play a sound for the player dying. But here under this one, we can play a sound for the enemies dying. So just under sounds, we have enemy die. And let's just drag that one up as well. And we have the last 2 sounds left. So when the bomb explodes, so for our explode, we have an explosion object. And because this is created and the explosion happens, we can just put this inside the create event for this object. So just here, and we want to pick our explode. I'm just going to leave that as 1. There's no need to change that because it doesn't happen too often. And therefore in the create event, this will play. It only happens once. Now, the last one was for our bow firing. And inside the player's check fire is where that happens. So if we look at the code, we check for our can attack, and then we set can attack to false. So all of this only happens once. And we can just pop it down the bottom here. If I click on the apply to and paste, then that's outside of this. And here we can just choose that last sound effect. And therefore all our sounds here are done. So actually we can just drag them back into sounds now. We don't need to keep this anymore. Right, let's test it out. Okay, so we have our enemies alert and the enemy attack sound. We've got our arrow sound. When our arrow hits the wall, we have that impact as well. Okay, we've got an explosion sound. Great, that all sounds really good. Now, if you want to add more features like a subtle footstep sound that syncs with the player's actual footsteps, or a dash sound, and even the shadows on the entities like we have in the original video, I'm going to add a Patreon bonus with all of these features over on the Patreon site. Now, Patreon has a free tier for when you follow someone over on the site. I'm going to add the shadow feature as a free tier. So if you want to see how to do that, go and visit Patreon site and you can find out how to add the shadow for enemies and players. Now, all of these videos are made possible by the generous support I get over on Patreon. So in appreciation of their contributions, I am making a few more Patreon only videos with those small features. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you in the next one.